Welcome back. In this lecture, we will bring together three ideas that we have already met in week 1: ecology, biodiversity, and sustainability. Until now, we have considered them mainly as separate concepts. Today, the main task is to connect them into one logical chain. Once we see how they fit together, it becomes easier to understand environmental problems, human dependence on nature, and the basis of responsible decision making. Here is the path for today. We will first recap the three core concepts, then we will build the chain that links them. After that, we will look at feedback loops because the relationship is not one way. We will then see why it matters in real systems such as agriculture, cities, and coasts. Finally, we will use this lecture as a bridge from week 1 into week 2. The three ideas from week 1 were ecology, biodiversity, and sustainability. It is useful to keep them in mind not as three isolated definitions, but as three parts of one framework. Ecology tells us how living systems operate. Biodiversity tells us what living variety exists within them. Sustainability asks whether human ways of living and developing can continue over time without breaking those systems. Let us begin with ecology. Ecology explains how living systems work. It studies interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environments. That means ecology is concerned with relationships, not just with individual species taken alone. It helps explain why organisms occur where they do, why some are abundant and others are rare, and how processes such as competition, cooperation, predation, nutrient cycling, and energy flow shape the system as a whole. Biodiversity contributes something different. It describes the variety of life. It includes different forms of life and different levels of biological organization, such as genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Biodiversity adds richness and variation to living systems. A forest, for example, is not simply a mass of green life. It contains many organisms, many roles, and many forms of difference. That variation matters because living systems are built from it. Sustainability adds a long term human question. It asks whether human systems can persist responsibly. It connects present needs with the needs of future generations. It also reminds us that development cannot be judged only by short term gain. It must be judged within ecological limits. In that sense, sustainability is not only about growth or management, it is about whether our way of using the world can continue without steadily weakening the natural systems that support us. Now we can link all the three together. We can state the conceptual chain clearly. Ecology explains how living systems work. Biodiversity describes the variation within those systems. And sustainability asks how human systems can persist without eroding the ecological foundations beneath them. This chain is important because it moves from understanding to structure to judgment. We first understand the system, then recognize its living complexity, and then ask how people can live within it without causing long term damage. This chain is useful because it connects science with application. It links description with explanation and explanation with action. It also connects ecological integrity with human futures. Without such a chain, thinking becomes fragmented. We may discuss biodiversity as a list of species or sustainability as a policy slogan without seeing how both depend on ecological reality. This integrated chain will organize much of the course, and so it is worth understanding carefully now. Let us follow the chain from ground up. Organisms interact. From those interactions, populations and communities form. Communities, together with physical conditions, create ecosystems. Ecosystems then produce outcomes on which humans depend, such as fertile soils, water regulation, climate moderation, and food production. Sustainability depends on keeping this chain intact. If the ecological base is weakened, human benefits will also weaken, even if the damage is not immediately visible. Building on that idea, ecology without biodiversity would be too thin. Living systems are not made of identical parts. Variation matters for system behavior. Different species play different roles, and even variation within a species can matter under changing conditions. So, a system with little diversity may be able to function in a narrow range of conditions, but it may respond poorly to stress. So, ecology needs biodiversity because system processes depend on real living differences, not on abstract organisms. But the reverse is also true. Biodiversity without ecology would be too static. Diversity is more than a list of names. If we only record what is present, we still do not know how the system functions. Presence alone does not explain things like pollination, nutrient cycling, food webs, stability, or change over time. Ecology gives biodiversity meaning by showing the relationships and processes through which living variety becomes functional. Without ecology, biodiversity remains just a mere description without any explanation. And the same logic also applies to sustainability. Sustainability without ecology would be blind. Sustainable decisions require knowledge of ecological systems. Without knowledge, we will not be able to make sustainable decisions. We cannot judge limits, recovery, carrying capacity, or likely consequences unless we understand how the system actually works. Human planning must therefore be informed by ecological reality. Otherwise, sustainability becomes only a desirable word with no grounding, which is something we also refer to as greenwashing of our actions. A plan may look efficient in the short term and still fail because it ignores the system processes. Sustainability without biodiversity would also be incomplete because ecosystem resilience, the ability to bounce back after a disturbance, often depends on diversity. Function depends not only on the existence of life in general, but also on who is present and how those organisms differ. Genetic loss and species loss can weaken systems quietly, long before complete collapse becomes obvious. And this is why sustainability must include biodiversity integrity. A system may appear productive for some time while losing the diversity that supports its long-term strength. So we can summarize the three ideas in a compact way. Ecology is about processes. Biodiversity is about variation. And sustainability is about persistence over time. When we put them together, we get a framework for understanding living systems and human futures at the same time. This is more powerful than any one concept on its own because real environmental questions almost always involve all three: how the systems work, what living diversity it contains, and whether our relationship with it can last. Now let us move from a simple chain to feedback loops. Biodiversity supports ecosystem function, and ecosystem function supports ecosystem services. Ecosystem services support human well-being. But human actions do not stand outside this chain. It's not a one-way street. Human actions push back on it. People can strengthen or weaken the whole system through management, restoration, extraction, pollution, and land use change. So the relationship is circular. It's not a linear relationship. Human society depends on ecosystems and also reshapes them continuously. First, biodiversity influences ecosystem function. Different organisms contribute different roles. Some pollinate, some decompose, some build soil, some regulate pests, and some help move energy and nutrients through food webs. Their interactions support productivity and regulation. Diversity can also support resilience under change because when conditions shift, systems with more living variation often have more ways to continue functioning. In this sense, ecological function emerges from living complexity rather than from isolated parts. But the next step is from ecosystems function to ecosystem services. Functions are ecological processes. Services are the usable benefits that people receive from those processes. Soil processes support agriculture by maintaining fertility. Vegetation and wetlands regulate water by slowing flow, by filtering it, and by helping recharge. Coastal ecosystems reduce physical risk by buffering wave action and stabilizing shorelines. So, when we say that ecological processes become human supports, we mean that functioning ecosystems quietly sustain daily life. From there, ecosystem services also connect directly to human well being. Food systems depend on ecological processes such as pollination, soil formation, and water cycling. Water security depends on functioning watersheds, wetlands, and vegetation cover. Health depends partly on environmental quality, including clean air, clean water, and stable surroundings. Many livelihoods also depend on ecological stability, especially where farming, fishery, forestry, or nature based tourism are important. Human well being is therefore partly ecological well being in another form. But the loop does not end there. Human actions push back on the change. Land use change can reduce biodiversity by replacing varied habitats with simplified landscapes. Pollution can weaken ecological function by harming soils, water bodies, and organisms. Overuse can degrade ecosystem services until systems produce less and recover more slowly. At the same time, good management can restore the chain. Conservation, careful design, and ecological restoration can strengthen biodiversity, function, and human benefits altogether. This slide brings the full system together. Living diversity supports ecological function. Ecological function supports human life. Human choices then reshape the living diversity. Sustainability depends on managing this loop wisely. That means not treating human welfare and ecological integrity as separate worlds. They are joined completely, intricately. When we damage the ecological side, the human side is affected sooner or later. When we manage the relationship thoughtfully, we improve the chances of persistence for both ecosystems as well as societies. But why does this matter in practice? It matters because the real sectors depend on this chain whether we notice it or not. Agriculture depends on pollinators and soils. Cities depend on water regulation, green cover, and climate moderation. Coasts depend on mangroves, wetlands, and other protective ecosystems. And these are not abstract examples. They show that ecology, biodiversity, and sustainability are linked in everyday systems where food, safety, comfort, and livelihoods are at stake. Let us begin with agriculture. Farms are often treated only as production spaces, but they are also ecological systems. Pollination supports many crops, and soil biodiversity supports fertility through decomposition and nutrient cycling. Pest regulation can depend on ecological balance rather than only on repeated chemical control. The image of cultivated land here reminds us that agricultural landscapes are living landscapes. Unsustainable intensification may raise the output for a while, but it can weaken the long term productivity on which farming depends. The same integrated view also applies to cities. Urban areas may look dominated by buildings and roads, as this image suggests, and yet they depend on ecological processes. Green cover moderates heat and improves comfort. Urban wetlands and vegetation affect how water moves, how quickly runoff builds, and how much flooding risk rises. Urban sustainability therefore depends partly on ecological design. A city is not outside nature, it is a human shaped system still operating within ecological realities and ecological constraints. Coastal systems provide another clear example. Mangroves and wetlands can buffer coasts. They help reduce risk by absorbing energy, by stabilizing shorelines, and by supporting ecological complexity. Coastal ecosystems also support fisheries and habitat. So their value is both protective and productive. The coastal image on this slide helps us think at landscape scale, where settlements and ecosystems share the same space. When those ecosystems degrade, biodiversity loss can turn them directly into a disaster risk issue for human communities. This slide invites us to see one landscape as performing many functions at once. We can see settlements, surrounding land, and coast in one view. Scientifically, that matters because one landscape may support habitat, water movement, climate moderation, recreation, livelihoods, and human settlement altogether. We should resist the habit of assigning only one meaning to any place. Landscapes are multifunctional, and good sustainability thinking depends on recognizing that overlapping character. So, how do we look at one landscape scientifically? We can ask a sequence of linked questions. What organisms are present? What interactions are occurring? What functions are being supported? What services do people receive? What human pressures are visible? This is a very useful way to train environmental reasoning. When you study any real place, these questions help move from one surface appearance to ecological understanding and then to sustainability judgment. That leads us from description to diagnosis. Ecology helps diagnose system processes. Biodiversity helps diagnose the living structure. Sustainability helps diagnose long term viability. And together, they improve decision making because they tell us not only what exists, but what is happening, what may be at risk, and whether the current path can continue. This is a major step forward. Environmental study then becomes more than observation. It becomes informed interpretation linked to future consequences. Managers need this integrated view because their work involves real systems, not separate textbook categories. Protected areas need ecological reasoning to understand processes and pressures. Restoration needs biodiversity understanding so that recovery is not reduced to simply planting something green. Development planning needs sustainability judgment so that short term gains do not create long term damage. Fragmented thinking, on the other hand, creates poor decisions because each part may seem acceptable alone while the combined outcome becomes harmful. Policy also needs this integrated view. Policy cannot focus only on short term outputs, such as rapid production or visible infrastructure, without asking what ecological damage may be building underneath. Ecological damage often creates hidden future costs. Biodiversity loss may also weaken public welfare indirectly by reducing resilience, water quality, productivity, or safety. Sustainable policy, therefore, needs ecological literacy. Good policy is not only socially and economically informed, it must also be ecologically informed. And this integrated view matters for learning as well. And many future topics will rely on these connections. It supports systems thinking, which means seeing relationships, dependencies, and consequences rather than isolated facts. It also prevents oversimplified environmental reasoning. When we try to explain any issue by connecting process, diversity, and persistence, we build a strong foundation for applied analysis. Now, let us examine a common mistake. Biodiversity is often treated as decorative, as if it matters mainly for scenic beauty or emotional appreciation. Those values do matter, but they are not enough. Biodiversity is a part of the ecological infrastructure of a place. Function and resilience depend on living diversity. A wetland with many interacting organisms is not just visually interesting, it is performing work. Sustainability cannot treat biodiversity as optional because the functioning of the system partly depends on it. Another common mistake is treating sustainability as separate from ecology. Sustainability is not only a policy language, a slogan, or a moral intention. It depends on ecological limits and ecological processes. Human goals must be judged against system realities. A development pathway is not sustainable simply because it is planned or desirable. It must be workable within the living and physical conditions of the system. Ecology keeps sustainability grounded in reality rather than aspiration alone. And a third mistake is treating ecology as only nature study in remote or wild places. Ecology certainly includes wild landscapes, but it is not limited to them. It also applies to farms, cities, coasts, and other managed systems. So, for example, we talk about agricultural ecology, urban ecology, coastal ecology, and so on. Human systems are embedded in ecological systems, and that is why applied ecology matters for sustainability. When we study ecology in this broader way, it becomes directly relevant to planning, management, conservation, and daily life. We can now combine the whole lecture into one integrated question. How do living systems work? Now, this contains what variation do they contain? How do people depend on them? How can that relationship persist? And so on. So, this single question joins ecology, biodiversity, and sustainability in one single sequence. When you revise, try to keep this integrated question in mind. It can guide both conceptual understanding and the analysis of practical environmental challenges. This lecture also serves as a bridge. Week 1 focused on foundational definitions. This lecture turns those definitions into relationships. Week 2 will turn those relationships into applications. So the course is now moving from basic concepts towards trade offs, practice, and decision making. That shift is important. Once we understand that integrated chain, we are better prepared to evaluate how sustainability works in real settings where ecological limits and human needs interact. At this point, there are several key terms you should retain clearly: ecology, biodiversity, sustainability, ecosystem function, ecosystem services, human well being, feedback loops, and ecological limits. These are not separate vocabulary items to memorize mechanically. They connect with each other. During revision, you should practice linking each term to the next. That will help you build explanations rather than isolated definitions, which is much more useful for understanding and for answering applied questions. Let us synthesize week 1 in one compact form. Ecology explains, biodiversity diversifies, sustainability evaluates persistence, human actions affect the entire system, and integrated thinking is therefore essential. This synthesis matters because it shows that environmental understanding is not complete until we connect how systems work, what they contain, and how our actions influence their future. That combined view is the real takeaway from this week, not any single definition taken alone. For revision, there are four useful tasks. First, define the central meaning and scope of linking ecology, biodiversity, and sustainability. Second, distinguish this topic from related ideas and from common misconceptions. Third, explain the main mechanisms and consequences discussed in the lecture, especially the chain from biodiversity to function to services to well-being. Fourth, apply the idea to conservation, sustainability, or real-world decision making. If you can do all four, your understanding is becoming solid. Looking ahead, The next step is sustainability and sustainable development in greater depth. The focus will shift from definitions to applications and trade-offs. Week 2 begins with historical evolution and practical framing. That means we will not leave these concepts behind. Instead, we will use them more actively. The integrated view built today will help us understand later discussions about development choices, competing goals, and the challenge of making sustainability operational. For reflection, consider a real sustainability challenge such as declining water security, urban flooding, coastal vulnerability, soil degradation, or loss of pollinators. Then ask how the three ideas help explain it. Ecology helps you understand the process involved. Biodiversity helps you see the living structure and what may be weakening. Sustainability helps you judge long-term viability and better responses. When you reflect in this way, the concepts stop being definitions and become tools for solving problems. And that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.